Star Trek's classic 1960s Tribbles episode was made possible by a Star Trek Discovery story. When Star Trek, the original series, debuted in the 1960s, it broke new ground in science fiction television, daring to blend thoughtful allegory with wild imagination. Among its most beloved episodes is The Trouble with Tribbles, a whimsical, humorous installment that introduced fans to the adorable, rapidly multiplying furballs known as Tribbles. While the episode has long been viewed as a self-contained comedic gem, its legacy took a surprising turn decades later. With Star Trek Discovery, the franchise went deeper into its canon than ever before, unearthing connections, characters, and concepts that retroactively enrich the original episodes. In a twist of Trek lore magic, it's now possible to argue that the very existence of The Trouble with Tribbles was indirectly made possible by a Star Trek Discovery story that aired over 50 years later. This interplay between past and present Trek storytelling exemplifies how Star Trek has evolved from a forward-thinking space western into a rich tapestry of interlinked narratives that stretch across centuries, both in universe and in the real world. And no example better demonstrates that than the surprising thread connecting Discovery's strange science and questionable ethics to the fuzzy chaos aboard Deep Space Station K7. The Trouble with Tribbles, a light-hearted classic with underlying depth, first airing in December 1967, The Trouble with Tribbles was a tonal departure from the usually serious and philosophical episodes of TOS. Written by David Gerrold, the episode finds Captain Kirk and the crew of the USS Enterprise arriving at Deep Space Station K7 to oversee a critical grain delivery of quadrotriticale to a disputed planet, Sherman's Planet. But the seemingly routine mission is derailed when a traveling merchant, Serrano Jones, brings aboard Tribbles, small, furry, cooing creatures with an insatiable appetite and a dangerously fast reproductive rate. What begins as a cute distraction quickly spirals into chaos. The Tribbles overrun the ship, consume the valuable grain, and cause no end of frustration for Kirk. Despite its comedy, the episode cleverly satirized bureaucracy, Cold War politics, and even ecological balance, showing how something harmless can become a major problem when introduced into the wrong environment. It also deepened the antagonism between the Federation and the Klingons, providing one of the most memorable bar fights in Star Trek history. Yet at the time, the Tribbles were simply a fun one-off creation, a light respite from the show's often heavy themes. But modern Star Trek, especially with the advent of Discovery, rarely lets any part of its mythology stay static. Enter Discovery, a new era of Star Trek, a new origin for Tribbles. Star Trek Discovery, which premiered in 2017, was created to modernize the franchise while acting as a prequel to the original series. Its early seasons explored the Federation-Klingon War, science experimentation, and the limits of ethical decision-making in wartime. And it is here, buried among mycelial networks, rogue scientists, and secretive Section 31 missions, that a shocking origin story for the Tribbles began to take shape. Season 2 of Discovery introduces viewers to a morally ambiguous character, Commander later Captain Gabriel Lorca's replacement, the enigmatic and brilliant Section 31 operative, Emperor Philippa Georgiou from the Mirror Universe. But it's the reintroduction of Edward Larkin, a name that at first means little, who would become unexpectedly central to the Tribbles lore. In the short Trek's episode titled The Trouble with Edward, we meet Larkin, a xenobiologist stationed on the USS Cabot, who conducts unorthodox experiments. His obsession? Genetically modifying Tribbles. Unlike the innocent Tribbles from TOS, Larkin's version are engineered to reproduce even faster, ostensibly to use them as a food source for famine-stricken colonies. Larkin's reasoning is absurdly flawed, and his arrogance is his downfall. Despite orders to stop, he continues the experiment, and soon the ship is overrun. The episode ends with a devastating implication. Larkin's hyperbreeding Tribbles escape containment and are possibly responsible for spreading the invasive species across the quadrant. What was once a light comedic footnote in the original series suddenly has a chilling origin steeped in bioethics, reckless science, and the shadowy corridors of Section 31. A retcon that works, linking Discovery's Tribbles to classic Trek, It would be easy to dismiss The Trouble with Edward as a tongue-in-cheek addition to the canon. After all, short treks often leaned into experimentation and dark humor. But the implications are clear. Edward Larkin's meddling explains the central mystery of the original Tribbles episode, why they multiplied so uncontrollably. Tribbles weren't just biologically prolific, they were genetically modified to be that way. The brilliance of this retcon is how elegantly it slots into existing lore. Fans had always wondered how such a benign species became such a galactic menace. The original episode jokes about how quickly they reproduce, but never explains why. Discovery retroactively fills in the gaps. The Tribbles that overwhelmed the Enterprise in the 23rd century weren't just naturally fecund, they were engineered to be. The Federation's bioethics policies, often portrayed as rigid in later shows like The Next Generation, now seem like a necessary reaction to earlier abuses like Larkin's. It creates a connective tissue between the early optimism of TOS and the more cynical, complex universe of Discovery. Comedy with consequences. Star Trek's evolving tone. One of the great strengths of Star Trek is its tonal elasticity. It can tell deeply philosophical stories about sentience and morality one week and deliver a comedic episode the next. The Trouble with Tribbles was an early example of that range. But with Discovery's darker tone, the franchise doubled back to show that even the funniest stories can have grim consequences. What makes this even more interesting is that Discovery's take on the Tribbles is not entirely humorless. The Trouble with Edward is a satirical, almost absurdist episode, but it carries real consequences. The careless science, the bureaucratic shrugging, and the overconfidence of a mid-level officer all play into a critique of institutional failure, much like how TOS's Tribbles skewered Cold War tensions through grain negotiations and smug Klingon spies. The mirror works both ways. Discovery made the Tribbles' backstory darker, but it also highlighted the original episode's quiet cleverness. What once seemed like a comic relief episode now feels like a ticking time bomb with a hidden origin. The joke still lands, but with a slight shiver in hindsight. Connecting the dots, timeline implications, and fan reactions. Of course, Star Trek has always been malleable with canon. Fans are used to reconciling timeline inconsistencies, alternate universes, and ship redesigns. But in this case, the connection between Discovery and TOS feels intentional, not incidental. If Larkin's Tribbles escaped or were inadvertently released, it would make sense that by the time the Enterprise visits K7, the station is already dealing with an infestation risk without fully understanding its origin. More intriguingly, this also puts Cyrano Jones in a different light. Was he simply an innocent merchant selling what he thought?